The Georgia heat hung over Millbrook like a burial shroud, thick and suffocating in the August twilight of 1860. John Woltar's polished shoes squelched through the red clay mud between the cotton rows, his pristine butler's uniform a stark contrast to the gnarled, dying plants that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The air tasted of copper and decay, and something far worse that made his stomach lurch with each labored breath. He found Samuel hanging from the old oak tree at the field's edge, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. The rope had done its work, but not before other tools had been employed. John's hands trembled as he took in the sight of his friend's mutilated form, the flesh stripped in places, the fingers bent backward at impossible angles. Samuel's eyes, once bright with dreams of freedom, now stared sightlessly at the darkening sky. "Oh, Samuel," John whispered, his voice barely audible over the drone of cicadas. "You should have waited. We could have found another way." But there was no other way, was there? Not for men like them, not in this place where human souls were bought and sold like cattle, where hope was a luxury they could not afford. Samuel had tried to run 3 nights ago, and now he served as a warning to any who might harbor similar thoughts. John forced himself to look away from his friend's broken body and turned toward the sprawling plantation, house that dominated the landscape like a white-pillared monument to human cruelty. The Whitmore estate had stood for 3 generations, its Greek revival columns and wraparound porches speaking of old money and older sins. Spanish moss draped the surrounding oaks like funeral veils, and somewhere in the distance a whippoorwill called its mournful song. Behind the house, barely visible in the gathering dusk, stood the cistern. The ancient stone structure rose from the earth like a grave marker, its circular walls stained black with age and moisture. John had cleaned that cistern more times than he could count, descending into its depths on a rope ladder to scrub away the algae and debris. The water was always cold even in the height of summer, and it seemed to whisper secrets from its dark depths. Tonight, the cistern seemed to be watching him. John straightened his jacket and composed his features into the mask he had worn for 15 years, the face of perfect servitude, empty of thought or feeling. Master Cornelius would be expecting his evening brandy soon, and the family would gather for dinner at precisely 7 o'clock. They would discuss Samuel's fate over roast beef and sweet potatoes, their voices carrying the casual indifference of people who had never questioned their right to own other human beings. The back entrance to the house led through the kitchen, where Martha, the head cook, was putting the finishing touches on the evening meal. She was a mountain of a woman, her dark skin glistening with sweat from the heat of the stoves. She looked up as John entered, her eyes immediately reading the pain etched in his features. "You found him," she said simply. It wasn't a question. John nodded, unable to trust his voice. Martha had been like a mother to him since he'd arrived at the Whitmore plantation as a boy of 12, torn from his own family and sold to pay another master's debts. She understood grief in the way that only someone who had lived through countless losses could. "Best get yourself cleaned up," Martha said, her voice gentle but firm. "They'll be wanting their dinner soon, and you know how Master Cornelius gets when he's kept waiting." John washed his hands in the basin by the kitchen window, watching the water turn pink as Samuel's blood swirled down the drain. Through the glass he could see the cistern again, its dark mouth gaping like a wound in the earth. For a moment he could have sworn he saw faces in its black water, Samuel's face, and others he had known who had disappeared over the years. The dining room was a temple to excess, its mahogany table set with the finest china and silver. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows on the silk wallpaper, and oil paintings of stern-faced Whitmore ancestors glared down from gilded frames. The family was already seated when John entered, carrying the silver service on a gleaming tray. Cornelius Whitmore sat at the head of the table like a king on his throne. He was a man of 63 years, with silver hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to see through everything they looked upon. His face bore the weathered lines of someone who had spent decades in the Georgia sun, overseeing his empire of human misery. Tonight he wore a satisfied smile that made John's skin crawl. "Ah, John," Cornelius said, his voice carrying the cultured drawl of old Southern aristocracy. "I trust you discovered what remained of poor Samuel?" "Yes, sir," John replied, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. He began pouring the wine with practiced precision, his movements fluid and automatic. "A pity," Adelaide Whitmore remarked from her seat at the opposite end of the table. She was a handsome woman of 58, her blonde hair now streaked with silver and arranged in an elaborate coiffure. Her blue silk dress was worth more than most people earned in a year, and diamonds glittered at her throat like captured stars. He was such a strong worker. But I suppose examples must be made. Their son Thaddeus, 26 and the very image of his father, laughed as he carved his beef. Did you see his face when they brought him back? I thought he might actually wet himself from fear, though I suppose he had good reason to be frightened. Thaddeus, his sister Magnolia chided, though her green eyes sparkled with amusement. At 24, she was considered the belle of Millbrook County. Her auburn hair and porcelain complexion, the envy of every eligible young woman for miles around. Such talk at dinner. You'll spoil my appetite. Nothing could spoil your appetite, sister dear. Thaddeus replied with a grin. You eat like a field hand, I do not. Magnolia protested. But she was laughing now, the sound high and musical. To anyone observing from outside, they might have seemed like a normal, loving family sharing an evening meal. John continued his service, moving around the table like a ghost, refilling glasses and replacing empty dishes. He had perfected the art of invisibility over the years, becoming so much a part of the furniture that the family spoke freely in his presence, never considering that he might hear their words or understand their meaning. I do hope the other Negroes took the lesson to heart, Adelaide said, delicately cutting a piece of sweet potato. We can't have them getting ideas above their station. The very foundation of our society depends on maintaining proper order. Oh, I believe they understood perfectly, Cornelius replied, taking a long sip of his wine. John, what was the mood in the quarters tonight? Any sign of unrest? John paused in his service, acutely aware that all eyes were now upon him. No, sir, he said carefully. Everyone seemed subdued. Good, Cornelius nodded approvingly. You've always been one of our most reliable servants. John, your loyalty hasn't gone unnoticed over the years. The words felt like acid in John's ears. Loyalty. As if he had chosen this life, as if he served them out of love rather than the constant threat of violence. He thought of Samuel again, of the terror in his friend's eyes when they had dragged him back to face his punishment. Thank you, sir, John managed to say, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. As the family continued their meal, John retreated to the shadows near the kitchen door, waiting to be summoned for the next course. Through the tall windows he could see the cistern again, its stone walls now silver in the moonlight. The water within seemed to ripple without any breeze to disturb its surface, and for a moment, John thought he heard something. A whisper, perhaps, or the echo of a long-ago scream. The conversation continued around the table, touching on cotton prices and the upcoming harvest, on social events and political discussions about the growing tensions between North and South. They spoke of human beings as if they were livestock, casually discussing which slaves might be sold to pay debts and which ones would be kept for breeding purposes. That young girl, what's her name? Celia, Adelaide mused. She's of breeding age now. Perhaps it's time to pair her with one of the stronger bucks. An excellent idea, my dear, Cornelius agreed. We could use more workers, and it's always more economical to breed them ourselves rather than purchase from the markets. John's hands clenched into fists behind his back. Celia was barely 16, a sweet girl who helped in the laundry and still cried for her mother in the night. The thought of these people treating her like a broodmare made his vision blur with rage. John, Magnolia called suddenly, her voice sharp with annoyance. My glass is empty. Must I ask twice? No, miss. My apologies. John moved forward to refill her wine, his movements controlled despite the storm raging within him. As he leaned over her shoulder to pour, Magnolia turned her head slightly and smiled up at him. A cold, calculating smile that never reached her eyes. You know, Father, she said conversationally, still looking at John, I've been thinking we might need to make another example soon. Some of the house servants have been getting rather familiar in their manner lately. The threat was unmistakable, and John felt a chill run down his spine despite the oppressive heat. Magnolia had always been the cruelest of the family, perhaps because her beauty and charm made her seem less dangerous than her father or brother. But John had learned long ago that her pretty face hid a heart as black as the water in the cistern. An interesting observation, Cornelius said, studying John with those cold blue eyes. We must always remain vigilant against such insolence. As the evening wore on, John continued his duties with mechanical precision. But his mind was elsewhere, wandering through memories of Samuel's friendship, of all the indignities and cruelties he had endured over the years, of the daughter who had been sold away when she was only 10 years old, and whom he would never see again. When the family finally retired for the evening, John began the long process of cleaning up after their meal. He cleared the table with methodical care, washing each piece of china and silver until it gleamed. The work was soothing in its routine, allowing his mind to wander and his rage to simmer just below the surface. Outside, the night sounds of rural Georgia created their ancient symphony, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of Spanish moss in the humid breeze. But underneath it all, John could swear he heard something else, a gentle lapping sound, like water against stone walls. The cistern was calling to him. When his duties were finally complete, John stepped out into the night air. The heat had barely abated with the setting sun, and his shirt clung to his back with perspiration. He walked slowly toward the cistern, drawn by an impulse he couldn't quite name. The stone structure loomed before him, ancient and implacable. Someone had built it decades ago, perhaps when the plantation was first established, boring deep into the Georgia clay to reach the groundwater below. Over the years, it had been expanded and reinforced, its walls now rising nearly 6 feet above ground level and descending perhaps 20 feet below. John approached the rim and looked down into the black water. The surface was perfectly still, reflecting the stars like a mirror of the night sky. But as he watched, something seemed to move in those depths, a pale shape that might have been a face or perhaps just a trick of the moonlight. "Samuel," he whispered to the darkness. "I'm sorry, old friend. I should have stopped them. I should have done something." But what could he have done? He was one man against an entire system designed to crush people like him, to reduce them to property and strip away every shred of human dignity. For 15 years he had survived by being the perfect servant, by swallowing his pride and his rage and his humanity. Tonight, looking down into the cistern's black depths, John Woltar began to wonder what might happen if he stopped swallowing. The water rippled without any wind to disturb it, and for just a moment, John could have sworn he saw Samuel's face looking back at him from the depths, not tortured and broken as it had been in death, but peaceful and whole and somehow waiting for justice. The memories came to John Woltar in fragments, like shards of broken glass cutting through the darkness of his small quarters above the kitchen. Sleep eluded him as images from 15 years of servitude flickered behind his closed eyelids. A kaleidoscope of humiliation, pain, and loss that had shaped him into the hollow man he had become. He remembered his first day at the Whitmore plantation with crystal clarity, though he had been only 12 years old. The auction block in Savannah had been his introduction to his new reality. Standing naked and trembling, while strange hands prodded his muscles and examined his teeth like those of a horse. Cornelius Whitmore had been younger then, his hair still dark and his face not yet etched with the lines of cruelty that would come with age. "This one's got good bones," the younger Cornelius had said to his wife, who was then a beautiful woman of 43, with golden hair and eyes like chips of winter sky. "He'll make a fine house servant with proper training." Adelaide had studied John with the dispassionate gaze of someone evaluating livestock. "He's rather thin. Are you certain he's worth the price?" "House servants don't need the bulk of field hands, my dear. Intelligence and obedience are far more valuable qualities in domestic staff." John had stood there, understanding every word yet powerless to speak, already learning the first lesson of his new existence. He was no longer a person, but property to be discussed and evaluated by his betters. The ride to Millbrook had taken 3 days in the back of a wagon, chained to 2 other newly purchased slaves, a middle-aged woman named Ruth who would work in the laundry, and a boy even younger than John who would tend the livestock. The boy had cried for his mother the entire journey, until Ruth finally took pity on him and held him against her ample bosom, humming spirituals to calm his fears. John had not cried. He had learned at an early age that tears were a luxury that brought only more pain. Instead, he had watched the Georgia landscape roll past and tried to memorize every detail of the journey, filing away information that might someday prove useful if he ever found the courage to run. The Whitmore estate had seemed like a palace to his 12-year-old eyes, the grand white columns, The manicured gardens, the air of prosperity that hung over everything like expensive perfume. He had not yet learned to see the rot beneath the beautiful facade, or to recognize the screams that echoed from the slave quarters on nights when discipline needed to be administered. Martha had taken him under her wing from the beginning, teaching him the intricate protocols of serving the master's family, how to set a proper table, how to pour wine without spilling a drop, how to stand perfectly still for hours without attracting notice. Most importantly, she had taught him how to make his face a blank slate, showing nothing of the thoughts or feelings that churned beneath the surface. "You got intelligence in your eyes, boy," Martha had told him during his first week. "That can be a blessing or a curse in a place like this. Learn to hide it well or it'll get you killed." John had been an apt pupil, perhaps too apt. Within 6 months, he had caught the attention of Cornelius himself, who declared him suitable for training as a personal servant. The old butler, a dignified man named Jefferson who had served the family for 30 years, had been reluctant to take on an apprentice. Masters took a shine to the boy, Jefferson had confided to Martha one evening when he thought John was out of earshot. "But there's something about him that troubles me. He learns too quickly, sees too much. One day all that knowledge is going to turn dangerous." Jefferson had been right, though it had taken 15 years for his prophecy to come true. The training had been brutal in its precision. Every gesture, every word, every facial expression had to be perfect. John learned to anticipate his master's needs before Cornelius himself was aware of them. He memorized the family's routines, their preferences, their moods and temperaments. He became a shadow in their lives, essential yet invisible, trusted yet never truly accepted. Thaddeus had been 11 when John arrived, a cruel child who delighted in tormenting those who couldn't fight back. He had discovered early that John made an excellent target for his games, intelligent enough to understand the humiliation but powerless to retaliate. John remembered the day Thaddeus had convinced him to steal apples from the kitchen, then told his father that the new houseboy was a thief. The beating that followed had left scars on John's back that were still visible 15 years later. But worse than the physical pain had been the lesson it taught. Even acts of kindness or trust could be weaponized against him. "You must understand, John," Cornelius had said after administering the whipping himself, his voice calm and reasonable as John bled into the dirt. "Theft is a sin against God and man. I beat you not out of anger but out of love, to save your immortal soul from damnation." That had been John's introduction to the peculiar logic of slavery, where cruelty was disguised as kindness and oppression was justified as salvation. Magnolia had been 9 then, a beautiful child with ringlets of auburn hair and a smile that could charm angels. She had seemed almost sympathetic to John's plight in those early days, sometimes sneaking him extra food or speaking gently when her parents weren't watching. He had foolishly allowed himself to believe that she might be different from the rest of her family. The illusion had been shattered on his 14th birthday. Not that anyone remembered or acknowledged such things for slaves. Magnolia had asked him to help her retrieve a kitten that had become trapped in the cistern, its pitiful mewing echoing up from the depths. John had volunteered to climb down and rescue the creature, thinking he was performing an act of mercy. The kitten had been dead when he found it, its small body floating in the black water. But that hadn't been the worst discovery. As he had held the lifeless animal in his hands, Magnolia's laughter had drifted down from above, not the innocent giggle of a child, but something cold and calculating that had made his blood freeze. "Silly John," she had called down to him. "Did you really think I cared about some mangy kitten? I just wanted to see if you were stupid enough to climb down there for me." She had left him trapped in the cistern for 3 hours before finally sending help, claiming she had forgotten about him. The message had been clear. Even her apparent kindness was just another form of control, another way to demonstrate his powerlessness. Adelaide's cruelties had been more subtle but no less devastating. She had a talent for finding a person's deepest vulnerabilities and exploiting them with surgical precision. When John was 16, he had fallen in love with a girl named Celia who worked in the main house. Not the same Celia the family had discussed at dinner, but another girl with the same name who had worked there years earlier. Adelaide had discovered their secret meetings and had taken great pleasure in arranging for the girl to be sold to a plantation in Alabama, making sure John understood that his feelings had been the direct cause of her suffering. She had presented this as a lesson in the dangers of becoming too attached to temporary pleasures. "Love is a luxury you cannot afford, John," she had told him with mock sympathy. "The sooner you accept this truth, the less pain you'll cause yourself and others." The lesson had been reinforced when John was 22 and briefly married to a woman named Sarah who worked in the fields. They had been permitted to wed in a ceremony that the slaves called jumping the broom, a union recognized by their community, but not legally binding in the eyes of the law. For 2 precious years, John had tasted something approaching happiness. Sarah had given birth to a daughter they named Grace, a beautiful child with her mother's gentle eyes and her father's quick intelligence. For a brief, shining moment, John had allowed himself to hope that life might contain something beyond mere survival. The hope had been crushed when Grace was 10 years old, and Sarah had grown too ill to work effectively in the fields. Cornelius had decided that maintaining a sick slave was economically unsound, and Sarah had been sold to pay off a gambling debt. Grace had gone with her mother, as slave children always did, leaving John alone with nothing but memories and the bitter knowledge that love was indeed a luxury he could not afford. He had not allowed himself to care deeply about anyone since then, though he maintained friendships with people like Samuel out of necessity and basic human decency. The Whitmore family had succeeded in breaking something essential within him, turning him into the perfect servant they had always wanted, obedient, efficient, and emotionally hollow. But now, lying in his narrow bed above the kitchen, John realized that the hollowness had been gradually filling with something else over the years. Each humiliation, each loss, each casual cruelty had added another drop to the reservoir of rage that had been building within him. Samuel's death had been the final drop, the one that caused the vessel to overflow at last. Through his small window, John could see the cistern gleaming in the moonlight like a watchful eye. The ancient structure had been present for every moment of his degradation, a silent witness to 15 years of accumulated grievances. How many times had he cleaned its walls, descended into its depths, felt the cold touch of its black water against his skin? The cistern knew all his secrets, had absorbed all his tears and sweat and blood over the years. It had become as much a part of him as his own heartbeat, and tonight, it seemed to be calling to him with promises of something he had never dared to imagine: justice. The memories continued to flow through the night like a river of poison, each one adding weight to the chains that bound not just his body but his soul. He remembered Jefferson's death from pneumonia when John was 18, and how Cornelius had refused to call a doctor because treating sick slaves was an unnecessary expense. He remembered Ruth's son being sold when he was only 8 years old, the child's screams echoing across the plantation as he was loaded into a wagon bound for unknown horrors. He remembered 1,000 small cruelties, 1,000 casual humiliations, 1,000 moments when his humanity had been stripped away piece by piece until nothing remained but the shell of a man who existed solely to serve others. But shells could be filled with new contents, and John was beginning to understand what his particular shell might contain. As dawn approached, he rose from his bed and performed his morning ablutions with the same mechanical precision that governed all his actions. He dressed in his spotless uniform, combed his graying hair, and prepared to begin another day of perfect servitude. But behind his carefully composed features, something new was stirring, something that had been building for 15 years and was finally ready to emerge from its cocoon of forced dormancy. The cistern waited in the growing light, its waters dark and still and patient. It had been waiting for 15 years, and it could wait a little longer. Soon, John thought as he descended the stairs to begin his daily duties. Very soon. From the kitchen, Martha looked up as he entered, her weathered face creased with concern. She had known him for 15 years, had watched him grow from a terrified child into a hollow man, and her keen eyes could detect the subtle changes in his demeanor. "You feeling all right this morning, John?" she asked quietly. "You look different somehow." John paused in his preparation of the master's morning tray, considering her question. How could he explain that he felt more alive than he had in years? That the numbness that had protected him for so long was finally beginning to thaw? How could he tell her that the perfect servant they had all known was starting to remember what it felt like to be human? "I'm fine, Martha," he said at last, his voice steady and controlled. "Just thinking about Samuel." She nodded sadly, understanding the grief that loss could bring. But she didn't understand the other thing that Samuel's death had brought, the final piece of knowledge that John needed to complete the picture. that had been forming in his mind for months. The knowledge that some chains could only be broken by drowning. The oleander bushes that lined the garden path had always been beautiful, in their deadly perfection. Clusters of pink and white blossoms that could kill a grown man with just a few leaves properly prepared. John had learned about their poisonous properties years ago from old Jefferson, who had warned him never to let the family's children near them during his garden walks. Pretty as they are, those flowers are pure death, Jefferson had said, his weathered hands gentle as he tended the safer plants. Every part of that bush can stop a heart if you know how to use it. Now, 3 weeks after Samuel's death, John found himself returning to those bushes in the pre-dawn darkness, carefully selecting the youngest leaves and storing them in a small cloth pouch hidden beneath his mattress. The knowledge felt like power coursing through his veins, the first real control he had exercised in 15 years of servitude. He started small, grinding a single leaf into powder and mixing it into Cornelius's morning coffee. Not enough to kill, just enough to cause discomfort, stomach pains, dizziness, a general feeling of malaise that would be attributed to the oppressive August heat, or perhaps something spoiled in the food. The effect was immediate and gratifying. Cornelius spent the morning clutching his stomach and complaining of nausea, eventually retreating to his study where he remained for the rest of the day. Adelaide fussed over him with genuine concern, sending John to fetch the doctor from town, a small, bitter irony that was not lost on him. The master seems to have come down with some sort of stomach ailment, Dr. Morrison pronounced after his examination, a thin man with spectacles and thinning hair who had been treating the Whitmore family for decades. Perhaps something he ate disagreed with him. I recommend a bland diet for the next few days and plenty of rest. John served the doctor tea with perfect composure, even as something wild and gleeful danced behind his carefully composed features. Power. Real power. For the first time in his adult life. The next day it was Adelaide's turn. A slightly larger dose mixed into her afternoon tea along with the honey she preferred. She spent the evening writhing with stomach cramps, her pale face flushed with fever as she called weakly for John to bring her cool cloths and weak broth. "I don't understand it," she whispered from her bed, her golden hair damp with perspiration. First Cornelius and now me. Perhaps there's something wrong with the water from the well. But John knew there was nothing wrong with the well water. He had tested that theory by drinking deeply from it himself, standing by the cistern in the moonlight as he contemplated his next move. The water was pure and cold, just as it had always been. It was during these midnight visits to the cistern that John first began to hear the whispers. At first, he dismissed them as wind moving through the Spanish moss or the distant sound of nightbirds calling to their mates. But as the days passed and his nocturnal pilgrimages to the stone structure became more frequent, the whispers grew clearer and more distinct. They spoke his name. "John," they murmured from the black depths, voices like water lapping against stone. "John Woltar, we've been waiting." He would lean over the rim and peer down into the darkness, searching for the source of the sounds. Sometimes, when the moon was full and its light penetrated the depths, he could swear he saw faces looking back at him. Samuel's face, and others he recognized from his years at the plantation. Slaves who had died from disease or overwork, who had been beaten to death for imagined infractions, who had simply disappeared one day and were never spoken of again. "Join us," the voices seemed to say. "Bring them to us. They belong here in the deep water where justice lives." John knew he should be frightened by these apparitions, should question his own sanity and seek help for what were clearly hallucinations brought on by grief and stress. But instead he found the voices comforting, like old friends offering counsel and encouragement. They understood what he had endured, what he was planning, what needed to be done. The whispers grew stronger each night, and with them came a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for far too long. By the end of the first week of his campaign, both Cornelius and Adelaide were bedridden with mysterious ailments that came and went without apparent cause. Thaddeus had begun to show symptoms as well, violent stomach cramps that left him pale and shaking, though he tried to maintain his usual arrogant demeanor. "It's something in this house," he declared to his sister over a breakfast he could barely touch, "some sort of miasma or contagion. Perhaps we should consider relocating to Charleston until it passes." Magnolia, who had so far escaped John's attention, looked thoughtful as she sipped her coffee that John had prepared with his usual meticulous care. Or perhaps, she said slowly, someone is deliberately making us ill. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. John, standing motionless by the sideboard with a silver serving tray in his hands, felt his heart skip a beat, but his face remained perfectly composed, showing nothing of the sudden spike of fear that shot through his nervous system. "What are you suggesting, sister?" Thaddeus asked, though his eyes had already begun to narrow with suspicion. "I'm suggesting that coincidences of this magnitude are rare," Magnolia replied, her green eyes scanning the room as if seeing it for the first time. 3 members of the family struck down with identical symptoms, while the servants remained perfectly healthy. "It seems unlikely." John's hands remained steady as he refilled the water glasses, but internally he was calculating distances to the door, escape routes through the house, hiding places in the quarters where he might find temporary sanctuary. He had always known this moment would come eventually, the moment when his actions would be discovered and his careful facade would crumble. But to his surprise, Magnolia's gaze passed over him without pausing, settling instead on the young girl who helped serve at table. "You," she said sharply to Celia, the 16-year-old who had been working in the house for only a few months. "What's your name again?" "Celia, miss," the girl replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She was a pretty thing with large dark eyes and skin the color of café au lait, and John could see her trembling under Magnolia's scrutiny. "Celia," Magnolia repeated thoughtfully, "you've been helping in the kitchen recently, haven't you? Assisting with meal preparation?" "Yes, miss. Just with the vegetables and such." "Nothing important?" "Nothing important," Magnolia echoed, her voice taking on a dangerous edge. "How interesting that our illnesses began shortly after you started working in the house." John watched in growing horror as the trap closed around the innocent girl. He wanted to speak up to redirect suspicion away from her, but he knew that any intervention on his part would only strengthen Magnolia's conviction that someone among the servants was responsible. "Please, miss," Celia pleaded, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. "I ain't done nothing wrong." "I wouldn't hurt nobody, wouldn't you?" Magnolia stood from her chair, her movements predatory and graceful. "Perhaps you thought you could make yourself indispensable by first making us sick, then nursing us back to health. Or maybe you're working with someone else, one of the field hands who's been filling your head with ideas about rebellion." The accusation was so far from the truth that John almost laughed. But the sound died in his throat as he realized what was about to happen. He had seen this pattern before, the need to blame someone, to find a scapegoat for problems that had no clear solution. Celia had been selected for destruction, and nothing he could say or do would save her without revealing his own guilt. That afternoon, Celia was dragged from the house and subjected to questioning that quickly escalated into torture. John was forced to watch from the kitchen window as they tied her to the whipping post and began extracting a confession through means that made his stomach churn with revulsion. Tell you where, girl held out longer than John would have thought possible, maintaining her innocence even as the overseer's whip opened bloody furrows across her back. But eventually pain and terror broke her resolve and she began to confess to crimes she had never committed. "Yes," she screamed through her tears. "Yes, I put something in the food. But it wasn't my idea. Samuel told me to do it before he died. He said the masters deserved to suffer." It was a lie born of desperation, an attempt to shift blame to someone who could no longer defend himself. But the Whitmore family seized upon it with savage satisfaction, as if Samuel's posthumous guilt somehow justified the brutality they were inflicting on an innocent girl. That night, as Celia's broken body was carried to the slave quarters, John knelt by the cistern and wept tears of rage and self-loathing. His quest for justice had claimed another innocent victim, adding to the mountain of guilt that already threatened to crush his soul. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the black water. "I never meant for her to suffer for my actions." The voices that rose from the depths seemed understanding, almost sympathetic. "Collateral damage," they murmured. "The price of revolution. She will understand in time." "Will she?" John asked, his voice breaking with emotion. "Ask her yourself," the voices replied. "She'll be joining us soon enough." John looked up in alarm, but the implication was clear. Celia's injuries were severe and infection was already setting in. Without proper medical care, which would never be provided to a slave who had confessed to poisoning her masters, she would likely be dead within days. Another death on his conscience. Another soul added to the growing chorus that called to him from the cistern's depths. As he walked back to the house that night, John realized that he had crossed a line from which there could be no return. The careful, measured approach he had planned was spiraling out of control, claiming victims he had never intended to harm. The Whitmore family's capacity for cruelty exceeded even his worst expectations, and their willingness to sacrifice innocent lives to protect themselves knew no bounds. If he was going to see this through, and he was beginning to understand that he had no choice in the matter, he would need to accelerate his timeline. The whispers from the cistern were growing more insistent each night, and the faces in its depths more numerous. Soon, they seemed to be saying. It must be soon before more innocents pay the price for your hesitation. John nodded grimly as he climbed the stairs to his small room above the kitchen. Soon, indeed. The foundation was cracking, and it was time to bring the whole structure down. But first, he needed to visit the oleander bushes one more time. This time, he would gather enough leaves to finish what he had started. Celia died on a Tuesday morning while the mockingbirds sang in the magnolia trees, their cheerful songs a cruel counterpoint to the girl's final, rattling breath. John heard about it from Martha, who delivered the news with the weary resignation of someone who had witnessed too many such deaths over the years. Poor child never had a chance, Martha said as she kneaded dough for the day's bread, her powerful hands working out some of the grief and anger she couldn't express in words. Infection took hold in those whip wounds, and there wasn't anything anyone could do. She kept asking for her mama right up until the end. John said nothing, but something cold and final settled in his chest like a stone dropped into still water, another innocent destroyed by his actions, another soul crying out for justice from beyond the grave. That night he heard Celia's voice joining the chorus that rose from the cistern's depths, young and sweet and heartbreakingly sad. "Why didn't you save me?" she whispered from the black water. "You could have told them the truth." "I'm sorry," John replied, his voice barely audible even to himself. "I was a coward." "Yes," the other voices agreed, a symphony of the dead and forgotten. "But cowardice can be cured. The question is whether you have the strength for the remedy." The family's health had improved somewhat since Celia's confession and subsequent death, as if her suffering had somehow purged the poison from their systems. John had stopped adding oleander to their food after the girl's arrest, partly from guilt and partly from the knowledge that suspicion was now focused elsewhere. But the improvement was temporary, and within days of Celia's burial in the slave cemetery, new symptoms began to appear. This time, John was more creative in his methods. A few drops of pokeweed extract in Adelaide's perfume bottle caused painful skin eruptions that baffled Dr. Morrison and left her face temporarily disfigured. Ground-up Jimson weed seeds mixed into Thaddeus's tobacco caused violent hallucinations that had him raving about demons and angels for the better part of a week. For Cornelius, John chose a more psychological approach. He began moving small objects around the master's study, shifting books to different shelves, relocating papers to wrong drawers, adjusting the position of the brandy decanter by just a few inches each day. The cumulative effect was to make the patriarch question his own sanity, wondering if the mysterious illnesses were affecting his mind as well as his body. "I could have sworn I left those documents on the left side of my desk," Cornelius muttered to Adelaide one evening as John served their after-dinner drinks. "But when I looked for them this afternoon, they were filed away in the wrong cabinet entirely." "Perhaps you moved them and simply forgot," Adelaide suggested, though her own voice carried a note of uncertainty. Her face was still healing from the mysterious rash that had erupted across her cheeks and forehead, leaving her looking haggard and years older than her actual age. "I don't forget things," Cornelius snapped, his temper shorter than usual due to the stress of the inexplicable events plaguing his household. "Someone has been in my study. Someone has been touching my private papers." The paranoia was spreading through the family like a contagion, and John found a dark satisfaction in watching them turn suspicious eyes toward their remaining servants. Trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to rebuild, and the Whitmore family was beginning to understand what it felt like to live in constant fear. But John's satisfaction was short-lived. The breaking point came on a sweltering Thursday afternoon in late August, when the air was so thick with humidity that breathing felt like drowning in slow motion. Magnolia had summoned him to her private sitting room, a frilly sanctuary decorated in shades of pink and white that made it look like the inside of a jewelry box. She was seated at her writing desk when he entered, her auburn hair pinned up to reveal the elegant curve of her neck. A small wooden box sat open before her, revealing an assortment of jewelry that caught the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows. "John," she said without turning around, her voice carrying a strange note that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "I seem to be missing something from my jewelry collection. My grandmother's pearl necklace, the one with the sapphire clasp. You wouldn't happen to know anything about it, would you?" John's blood turned to ice water in his veins. He had never stolen anything from the family, had never even been tempted despite the countless opportunities that his position afforded. The accusation was as false as the one that had killed Celia, but he could already see where this was leading. "No, miss," he said carefully, keeping his voice level and respectful. "I haven't seen your necklace." Magnolia turned in her chair to face him, and John was struck by how much she had changed over the past few weeks. The mysterious illnesses that had plagued her family had taken their toll on her as well, adding lines around her eyes and a hardness to her expression that made her beauty seem brittle and dangerous. "How strange," she mused, rising from her chair with fluid grace. "Because I distinctly remember seeing you admiring it just last week when you were cleaning my room. You held it up to the light and commented on how beautiful it was." The lie was so blatant, so easily disproven, that John almost protested his innocence. But then he saw the calculating gleam in Magnolia's green eyes, and realized that truth was irrelevant to what was happening here. She needed a scapegoat, someone to blame for the fear and uncertainty that had invaded her previously ordered world. Celia's death had provided only temporary relief. Now a new victim was required. "Miss, I would never," John began, but Magnolia cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Don't lie to me, John. It's insulting to both of us." She walked slowly around him like a predator circling wounded prey. "You've been with this family for 15 years. We've trusted you, treated you well, given you a position of responsibility and respect. And this is how you repay our kindness?" The word kindness hit John like a physical blow. 15 years of brutality, humiliation, and loss, and she called it kindness. The careful control he had maintained for so long began to crack, and he felt something dark and violent stirring in the depths of his soul. "We've been more than generous with you," Magnolia continued, her voice taking on the tone of injured righteousness that the family used to justify their cruelties. "But perhaps we've been too lenient. Perhaps we've allowed you to forget your proper place." She walked to the window and pulled the bell cord that would summon the overseer. John knew what was coming next, the same ritual that had claimed Samuel and Celia and countless others over the years. The accusation, the mock trial, the inevitable punishment that would serve as both retribution and warning to any who might harbor similar thoughts of rebellion. "Please, Miss Magnolia," John said, abandoning pride in a desperate attempt to avoid the horror he knew was coming. "I've served your family faithfully for 15 years. I've never stolen anything, never given you cause to doubt my loyalty. Please don't do this." For a moment, something that might have been doubt flickered across Magnolia's features, but it was quickly replaced by the cold certainty that had guided her family's actions for generations. "Loyalty?" She laughed, the sound high and brittle. "You call it loyalty when you've been poisoning our food and moving things around the house to drive us mad?" "Oh yes, John, we know it was you. The mysterious illnesses, the missing objects, the general air of malevolence that settled over our home. Who else could it have been? Who else has such intimate access to our private spaces?" John felt the last of his carefully maintained composure begin to crumble. She knew, somehow, despite all his precautions, Magnolia had pieced together the truth about his campaign of subtle revenge. The false accusation about the necklace was just a convenient excuse to do what she had already decided was necessary. The overseer arrived within minutes, a brutal man named Garrett who took obvious pleasure in his work. He was accompanied by 2 field hands who had been pressed into service as enforcers, their faces carefully blank as they avoided meeting John's eyes. "This Negro has been stealing from me," Magnolia announced, her voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "I want him whipped as an example to the others." "How many lashes, miss?" Garrett asked, his scarred hands already reaching for the coiled whip at his belt. 20, Magnolia said without hesitation, "and make sure the entire household watches. I want everyone to understand the consequences of betraying our trust." As they dragged him from the house toward the whipping post that stood in the center of the slave quarters like a monument to human cruelty, John felt something fundamental break inside him. Not his spirit that had been broken years ago, but something deeper and more essential. The last vestiges of his humanity, perhaps, or his faith in the possibility of justice in a world ruled by monsters. The whipping was brutal. Each lash of the cat-o'-nine-tails tearing through flesh and muscle with scientific precision. John had been beaten before, but never with such systematic thoroughness. Garrett was an artist with the whip, knowing exactly how to inflict maximum pain, without causing permanent damage that might reduce his victim's value as property. But the physical agony was nothing, compared to the psychological torture of being forced to maintain his innocence even as the leather strips flayed skin from his back. The assembled slaves watched in horrified silence, their faces reflecting the knowledge that any one of them could be next, that innocence was no protection against the arbitrary cruelty of their masters. After the beating, as John hung semi-conscious from the post with blood streaming down his back, Adelaide Whitmore approached with something clasped in her delicate hands. She waited until he lifted his head to look at her, then held up what she carried for him to see. It was a letter, yellowed with age and worn soft from countless readings. John's letter, the only one he had ever received from his daughter Grace after she had been sold away with her mother 8 years ago. The single connection he had maintained to the family that had been torn from him, the only tangible proof that he had once been more than just property. "I found this hidden in your room," Adelaide said, her voice carrying mock sympathy, "along with some other interesting items. Did you really think we wouldn't search your quarters after Magnolia's necklace went missing?" John's vision blurred with tears and pain, but he could see the letter clearly enough to make out Grace's childish handwriting, the words she had somehow convinced someone to help her write. She would be 18 now if she was still alive, a young woman who might not even remember the father who had been powerless to protect her. "Please," John whispered, his voice barely audible. "Please don't." Adelaide smiled, a cold, beautiful expression that transformed her face into something inhuman. "You should have thought of that before you decided to steal from us," she said. Then she struck a match and held it to the corner of the letter. John watched in helpless horror as the flames consumed his daughter's words, reducing 8 years of hope and love to ash and smoke. The letter curled and blackened in Adelaide's hands, and with it died the last light in John's soul. "There," Adelaide said, dropping the burning remnants at his feet. "Now you have nothing left but what we choose to give you. Perhaps that will help you remember your proper place." As the ashes of his daughter's letter scattered in the evening breeze, John felt something new and terrible being born in the hollow space where his heart had once been. The voices from the cistern were calling to him more urgently now, promising things that his rational mind knew were impossible, but that his broken soul desperately needed to believe. That night, as he lay face down on his narrow bed with his ruined back screaming in agony, John made the final decision that would seal all their fates. The careful plan he had been developing for weeks crystallized into sharp, deadly focus. He would need to move quickly now, before his wounds healed enough for him to be put back to work, before the family's suspicions faded and their guard dropped. Tomorrow night, he decided. When the moon was dark and the cistern's waters were black as the hatred in his heart, the voices from the depths seemed to approve, their whispers growing stronger and more urgent as the hours crept toward dawn. Soon, they promised. Soon justice would be served, and the weight of chains would finally be lifted from his shoulders, even if it meant drowning them all in the process. The night arrived moonless and thick with the promise of storm, the air so heavy with moisture that even the cicadas had fallen silent. John moved through the plantation house like a ghost made flesh, his feet silent on the polished hardwood floors he had cleaned countless times over the past 15 years. Every creak and whisper of the old mansion was known to him, every shadow a familiar companion in his nocturnal pilgrimage toward justice. His back still burned with the fire of yesterday's whipping, the wounds weeping through the rough bandages Martha had applied with trembling hands. But physical pain had become irrelevant now, subordinate to the greater purpose that drove him through the darkness. The voices from the cistern had been calling to him all day, growing stronger and more insistent as the sun set, and the appointed hour approached. In the kitchen, John prepared his final service with the same meticulous care he had shown for 15 years. The tea service gleamed in the lamplight, delicate porcelain cups painted with roses, a matching pot that had been in the Whitmore family for 3 generations. a silver tray that reflected his face like a dark mirror. Into the pot went the most potent combination of plant extracts he had ever prepared. Enough foxglove to stop a heart, Jimson weed to cloud the mind, and a massive dose of valerian root to ensure deep, dreamless sleep. The bitter almond scent of the mixture was masked by generous amounts of honey and cream, the family's preferred way of taking their evening tea. John had served them this same blend hundreds of times before, but tonight would be the last time anyone would taste Adelaide's precious Earl Grey in this house. He carried the tray through the darkened hallways, his movements automatic and sure despite the supernatural electricity that seemed to crackle in the air around him. Lightning flickered on the horizon, promising the storm that had been building all day, and in its brief illumination, John caught glimpses of faces in the windows, Samuel's face, Celia's, and dozens of others who had died on this cursed plantation over the decades. The family was gathered in the parlor, as was their custom on Friday evenings. They sat in their usual positions around the room, Cornelius in his massive leather chair by the fireplace, Adelaide on the settee with her embroidery, Thaddeus slouched in the window seat with a book of poetry, and Magnolia at the piano, her fingers picking out a melancholy tune that seemed to echo the approaching storm. "Ah, John," Cornelius said without looking up from his newspaper. "Perfect timing. I was just thinking how pleasant a cup of tea would be." "Of course, sir," John replied, his voice steady and controlled despite the wildness that roared beneath the surface. He began the familiar ritual of service, pouring each cup with the same precise movements he had, perfected over years of practice. The family accepted their tea with the casual entitlement of those who had never questioned their right to be served by others. They sipped and chatted about inconsequential matters, the weather, the upcoming harvest, social events in Millbrook's small but pretentious society. None of them seemed to notice the slight bitterness that lingered beneath the honey's sweetness, or the way John's hands trembled almost imperceptibly as he served. "This tea tastes different tonight," Adelaide commented after a few sips. "Did you prepare it differently, John?" "No, ma'am," John lied smoothly. "Perhaps the humidity is affecting the flavor. Everything tastes strange on nights like this." She nodded and took another sip, apparently satisfied with the explanation. Around the room, the other family members continued drinking their poisoned tea, each swallow bringing them closer to the darkness that awaited them. The effects began within minutes. Thaddeus was the first to succumb, his book sliding from nerveless fingers as his eyelids grew heavy. "Strange," he mumbled, his words already beginning to slur. "I feel peculiar." "I'm feeling rather tired myself," Magnolia said, her fingers faltering on the piano keys. The melody she had been playing dissolved into discordant notes before falling silent altogether. Cornelius tried to stand from his chair but found his legs unsteady beneath him. What's happening?" he asked, his voice thick with confusion and growing alarm. "John, what have you—" But the patriarch's words trailed off as the drugs took hold, his eyes rolling back in his head as consciousness fled. Adelaide lasted a few seconds longer, her maternal instincts fighting against the chemical tide that was drowning her awareness. "The children," she whispered, reaching out toward her son and daughter with hands that no longer obeyed her will. "Something's wrong. Help them." Then she too was gone, slumping forward on the settee like a marionette with severed strings. John stood in the sudden silence, surrounded by the unconscious forms of his tormentors. For a moment, doubt crept into his mind like smoke through a keyhole. These were human beings, whatever their sins, and what he was about to do would damn his own soul as surely as theirs. But then he remembered Samuel hanging from the oak tree, Celia dying in agony from infected whip wounds, his daughter's letter burning in Adelaide's cruel hands. The doubt passed like a summer storm, leaving only crystalline certainty in its wake. The voices from the cistern were louder now, calling to him through the walls of the house with increasing urgency. They spoke in languages he didn't recognize but somehow understood, promising him peace and justice and an end to the pain that had consumed his life for 15 long years. "Bring them to us," the voices whispered. "Bring them home." John began with Cornelius, the patriarch's considerable weight making the task difficult despite the older man's unconscious state. He half carried, half dragged the master of the house through the back door and across the yard toward the cistern, his wounded back screaming with every step. The night air was thick as syrup, charged with electricity from the approaching storm. And somewhere in the distance, a hound began to howl with primitive fear. The cistern waited in the darkness like an ancient altar, its stone walls gleaming with moisture. John had never measured its depth precisely, but he knew it was at least 20 feet to the water's surface, and the water itself was deep enough to swallow a man completely. Over the years, various animals had fallen into its depths and drowned. Cats, dogs, even a horse once, and their bodies had never been recovered. Tonight, it would claim larger prey. Cornelius stirred slightly as John positioned him at the cistern's edge, his drug-clouded mind fighting against the approaching darkness. For a moment, his eyes focused on John's face, and something like recognition flickered in their depths. "You," he whispered, the word barely audible above the rising wind. "It was you." "Yes," John said simply. "It was me." Then he pushed, and Cornelius Whitmore disappeared into the black water with barely a splash. The surface closed over him like a hungry mouth, and for a moment there was perfect silence. But only for a moment. Then the water began to churn and bubble, as if something vast and terrible was stirring in its depths. Faces appeared in the ripples, not just Cornelius's drowning features, but the faces of all who had died on this plantation over the decades. They seemed to be welcoming their former master to his new home, their expressions ranging from sad resignation to savage joy. John felt no satisfaction in the patriarch's death, only a hollow sense of completion. 1 down, 3 to go. Adelaide was next, her smaller frame making the journey easier despite John's exhaustion. She remained unconscious throughout the ordeal, her face peaceful and serene as he lowered her into the cistern's embrace. The water accepted her with the same hungry enthusiasm it had shown for her husband, and soon she too had vanished beneath its dark surface. The storm was closer now, its thunder rumbling across the Georgia sky like the footsteps of approaching giants. In the lightning's strobing illumination, John could see the water in the cistern beginning to rise, as if the addition of each body was somehow increasing its volume. That was impossible, of course. His rational mind knew that water couldn't simply multiply like that, but rationality had abandoned him somewhere between the kitchen and this moment of ultimate judgment. Thaddeus and Magnolia followed their parents into the depths, each disappearing beneath the surface with the same terrible finality. By the time John lowered Magnolia's unconscious form into the water, the cistern was nearly full to its brim, the black liquid lapping at the stone rim like eager tongues. The voices from below were a roaring chorus now, hundreds of souls crying out in triumph and relief. They spoke of justice served and debts repaid, of the natural order finally restored after decades of perversion and cruelty. John knelt at the cistern's edge and listened to their song, feeling tears stream down his face for the first time in years. "It's done," he whispered to the churning water. "They're yours now, and what of you?" The voices asked in unison. "Will you join us willingly, or must you be brought?" John considered the question with the detached curiosity of a man who had already made peace with his fate. He could run, perhaps, steal a horse and try to reach the north before his crimes were discovered. But he had nowhere to go. No one who would shelter a runaway slave, especially one guilty of murdering an entire white family. The law would hunt him down with dogs and ropes, and his end would be far more terrible than anything the cistern could offer. Besides, he was tired. So very, very tired. "I'll come willingly," he said, rising to his feet on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. "But not yet. I want to see them find the bodies. I want to watch their faces when they realize what happened here." The voices seemed to approve of this decision, their chorus growing softer and more patient. They had waited decades for justice. They could wait a few hours more. John walked back to the house as the first fat raindrops began to fall from the storm-darkened sky. Behind him, the cistern bubbled and churned with its new residents, the water level somehow still rising despite the impossibility of such a thing. By morning he knew it would be completely full, a black mirror reflecting the sky and hiding the truth beneath its deceptively calm surface. In the parlor, the teacups still sat where the family had left them, their contents now cold and bitter. John gathered them methodically, washing each piece with his usual care before returning it to its proper place in the china cabinet. Let the investigators puzzle over the disappearance of an entire family, with no signs of struggle. No evidence of violence beyond the empty teacups that had held their final meal. As he worked, The storm finally broke overhead, sending sheets of rain against the windows and shaking the old house to its foundations. Lightning illuminated the rooms in stark, black and white snapshots, and in each flash, John thought he saw figures standing in the shadows, Samuel and Celia and all the others, watching him with approval and anticipation. Soon, they seemed to be saying. Very soon now. John finished his cleaning and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the cistern through the driving rain. The water was indeed full now, level with the stone rim and perfectly still despite the storm raging overhead. 4 bodies lay beneath that placid surface, but somehow John knew that if anyone looked into its depths tomorrow, they would see nothing but clear, cold water reflecting the sky. The Whitmore plantation had claimed its final victims, and the cistern had finally received the offering it had been waiting for all these years. Justice, John reflected, sometimes wore a strange face, but it was justice nonetheless. As dawn approached and the storm began to subside, John settled into Cornelius's leather chair to wait for the inevitable discovery. He had no plans to flee or hide, no desperate schemes for escape. His work was done, and his fate was sealed as surely as that of the family now resting in their watery tomb. The voices from the cistern had grown quiet, but John could still feel their presence like a warm hand on his shoulder. They would be waiting for him when his time came, not as judges or executioners, but as friends welcoming him home after a long and terrible journey. Until then, he would sit and wait and remember what it felt like to be free. Dawn came reluctantly to the Whitmore plantation, the sun struggling through the heavy clouds left behind by the night storm. The air hung thick with moisture and the smell of wet earth. Spanish moss dripped steadily from the ancient oaks, and somewhere in the distance, a single mockingbird called out with heartbreaking clarity to the silent morning. John Woltar sat motionless in Cornelius Whitmore's leather chair, his hands folded in his lap and his eyes fixed on the parlor window that looked out toward the cistern. He had not moved for 3 hours, not since the last of the storm clouds had passed and the first pale light had begun to filter through the curtains. His back ached from his wounds, his throat was dry as dust. But these discomforts seemed to belong to someone else, a different man who had lived in a different world before justice had finally been served. The house around him was tomb quiet, filled with the oppressive silence that follows sudden death. Even the mice in the walls seemed to sense that something fundamental had changed, that the natural order which had governed this place for 3 generations had been overturned in a single night of reckoning. Through the window, the cistern appeared perfectly normal in the morning light, just an ancient stone structure surrounded by wet grass and wildflowers. The water within was still and clear, reflecting the gray sky like polished glass. No sign remained of the 4 bodies that lay somewhere in its depths, no evidence of the supernatural forces that had guided John's hand through the darkest hours of the night. The voices had fallen silent with the dawn, but John could still feel their presence like a warm current beneath the surface of his consciousness. They were patient now, content to wait for the final act of this long tragedy to play itself out. Soon enough he would join them in their watery sanctuary, and the last chapter of the Whitmore family's reign of terror would be written in blood and vengeance. The sound of approaching horses brought John back to the immediate present. He had been expecting this moment since the storm passed, knowing that someone would eventually come looking for the family when they failed to appear for their usual Saturday morning social obligations. The Whitmores were creatures of rigid habit, their lives governed by social calendars and business appointments that could not be ignored without consequence. Through the window, John watched as 3 riders approached the main house. Sheriff Benjamin Clayton, a thin, nervous man who had held his position more through political connections than any particular aptitude for law enforcement. Dr. Morrison, still carrying his black medical bag despite the early hour, and Reverend Marcus Webb, whose presence suggested that someone had already suspected the worst. John made no move to hide or flee as the men dismounted and approached the front door. He simply sat in perfect stillness, his hands folded and his face composed, waiting for the inevitable discovery that would seal his fate. The knocking, when it came, was hesitant at first, the polite rap of visitors who expected to be welcomed. When no one answered, the sounds became more urgent, more demanding. John could hear Sheriff Clayton calling out to the family, his voice carrying the forced authority of a weak man trying to project strength. "Mr. Whitmore, Mrs. Whitmore, this is Sheriff Clayton. We need to speak with you about some concerns that have been raised in town. More knocking, more calling, and then the inevitable decision to enter uninvited. John heard the front door creak open, followed by the cautious footsteps of men entering a house that felt empty as a tomb. "Hello?" Dr. Morrison's voice echoed through the hallway. "Is anyone home? Cornelius?" They found John in the parlor, sitting exactly as he had been for the past 3 hours. The 3 men froze in the doorway when they saw him, their faces reflecting a mixture of confusion and growing alarm. A Negro sitting in the master's chair was in sight so unprecedented, so fundamentally wrong in their ordered world, that for a moment none of them could speak. "You," Sheriff Clayton finally managed, his hand instinctively moving toward the pistol at his hip. "What are you doing here? Where's your master?" John looked up at them with eyes that held no fear, no guilt, no human emotion that they could recognize or understand. When he spoke, his voice was calm and steady, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "They're in the cistern," he said simply. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Dr. Morrison stepped forward, his medical training making him more comfortable with crisis than his companions. "What do you mean, they're in the cistern? Are they hurt? Do they need help?" "They're dead," John replied with the same unsettling composure. "All of them. I killed them last night." The confession hit the 3 men like a physical blow. Reverend Webb actually staggered backward, his face going pale as parchment. Sheriff Clayton's hand closed around his pistol grip, though he seemed unsure whether to draw it or not. "You're lying," Clayton said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The Whitmore family. You couldn't have. There are 4 of them, and you're just one. I poisoned their tea," John explained patiently as if he were discussing the weather. "Then I carried them to the cistern while they were unconscious. They never woke up. It was very peaceful." Dr. Morrison was already moving toward the door, his professional instincts overriding his shock. "We need to check the cistern immediately, if there's any chance they're still alive." But John shook his head slowly, a gesture that carried absolute finality. "There's no chance of that, Doctor. The water has claimed them just as it was always meant to do." The 3 men rushed from the house toward the cistern, leaving John alone with his thoughts and memories. Through the window, he watched them gather around the stone structure, peering down into its depths with growing horror. He saw Dr. Morrison lean far over the rim, then jerk back as if he had been struck. The physician's face was white with shock when he turned to his companions. "Sweet Jesus," Morrison whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "I can see them. All 4 of them, just floating down there like they're sleeping." Sheriff Clayton pushed past the doctor to look for himself, then immediately bent over and vomited into the grass. Reverend Webb fell to his knees and began to pray in a voice that cracked with horror and disbelief. John watched their reactions with detached interest, feeling neither satisfaction nor remorse. Justice had been served, and these men were simply witnesses to its completion. Their shock and revulsion were understandable but irrelevant. The deed was done, and no amount of moral outrage could undo it. They returned to the house with ropes and grappling hooks, determined to recover the bodies despite the grisly nature of the task. John observed their efforts through the window, noting how the water seemed to resist their attempts to disturb its new residents. Ropes slipped from nerveless fingers, hooks failed to find purchase, and more than once, one of the men would lean too far over the rim and nearly tumble into the depths himself. It took them 3 hours to retrieve the first body. Cornelius, his face blue and bloated but somehow peaceful in death. The patriarch who had ruled his domain with such iron authority looked small and fragile lying on the wet grass beside the cistern, diminished by death and the justice that had finally claimed him. The others followed one by one. Adelaide with her golden hair dark and tangled, Thaddeus still wearing the expression of confused surprise that had marked his final moments, and finally Magnolia, her beauty intact but somehow hollow, like a perfect shell emptied of its contents. Sheriff Clayton approached the house again as the sun reached its zenith, his face grim with the duty that lay before him. John rose from Cornelius's chair and walked to meet him at the front door, his movements calm and unhurried despite the iron shackles that awaited him. "John Woltar?" Clayton said, his voice formal and strained. "I'm arresting you for the murders of Cornelius, Adelaide, Thaddeus, and Magnolia Whitmore. You'll be held for trial in the county jail." "I understand," John replied simply. He held out his hands without being asked. accepting the shackles with the same resignation he had shown throughout his life of bondage. As they led him away from the plantation that had been his prison for 15 years, John turned back for one final look at the cistern. The water was calm and clear once more, reflecting the afternoon sky with perfect serenity. But for just a moment he thought he saw faces beneath the surface, not the drowned features of the Whitmore family, but the peaceful visages of Samuel and Celia and all the others who had suffered and died in this place. They were smiling. The trial, when it came 3 weeks later, was a foregone conclusion. John had confessed freely to his crimes, showed no remorse for his actions, and made no attempt to defend himself against the charges. The all-white jury deliberated for exactly 7 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. Judge Harrison Blackwood, a stern man with iron-gray hair and the moral certainty of the Old South, pronounced sentence with the weight of divine authority. John Woltar, you have been found guilty of the cold-blooded murder of 4 innocent souls. By the power vested in me by the state of Georgia, I sentence you to hang by the neck until dead. May God have mercy on your soul. John listened to the sentence without emotion, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the courtroom walls. He had expected no other outcome, had in fact welcomed the swift justice that would reunite him with those who waited in the cistern's depths. The execution was scheduled for the following Friday at dawn, and the entire county turned out to witness the hanging of the slave who had dared to murder his white masters. They came expecting to see fear and repentance, hoping for the spectacle of a broken man begging for mercy he would never receive. Instead, they saw something that chilled them to the bone. John Woltar walked to the gallows with the calm dignity of a man attending his own coronation. His back was straight, his head held high, and his eyes held no trace of the fear or desperation that usually marked condemned men in their final moments. When the rope was placed around his neck, he smiled, not with madness or defiance, but with something that looked disturbingly like peace. Any last words? The executioner asked, following the traditional ritual. John looked out over the crowd of white faces staring up at him with a mixture of fear and fascination. In the distance, barely visible through the morning mist, he could see the Whitmore plantation and the cistern that had become his instrument of justice. The water remembers, he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed silence. It remembers everything, and it's patient. Justice may be delayed, but it's never denied. The trapdoor opened, and John Woltar fell into darkness and the waiting embrace of those who had gone before. But the story did not end with his death. Within a month of the execution, strange reports began to filter in from the abandoned Whitmore plantation. Travelers on the road past the estate claimed to hear voices singing spirituals in the night, the sound drifting across the fields like wind through the cotton plants. Others reported seeing lights moving through the empty house after dark, as if the ghosts of the dead family were still going about their nightly routines. Most disturbing of all were the reports about the cistern itself. The water level, which had always remained constant regardless of weather conditions, began to fluctuate wildly. Some mornings it would be bone dry, the stone walls stained with what looked like ancient blood. Other days it would be filled to overflowing, the excess water spreading across the ground in patterns that reminded observers of reaching hands or grasping fingers. Local children began to dare each other to approach the cistern after dark, though few were brave enough to actually complete the challenge. Those who did claimed to see faces in the water, not just the familiar features of the murdered Whitmore family, but dozens of other faces, the visages of all who had suffered and died on the plantation over the decades. And sometimes, on nights when the moon was dark and the air was thick with humidity, people claimed to hear John Woltar's voice calling out across the water, speaking words of judgment and promised retribution to any who would continue the cycle of cruelty that had defined the Old South for so long. The plantation itself was never resold, never rebuilt, never reclaimed by the forces of civilization. It stood empty for decades, slowly crumbling under the relentless assault of Georgia weather and the weight of its own dark history. Eventually, the state condemned the property and had the main house demolished. But the cistern remained, too solidly built to be easily destroyed, too deeply rooted in the earth to be simply filled in and forgotten. It remains there still, according to local legend, hidden now by decades of overgrowth but still filled with its dark water and darker memories. On certain nights, when the conditions are just right, People claim they can still hear the voices of the dead calling out for justice from its depths. And perhaps, in a world where such terrible injustices were commonplace for so long, that's exactly as it should be. Some stories, after all, are too important to be allowed to die. What did you think of this dark chapter from 1860 Georgia? Subscribe for more macabre tales from American history, and tell us in the comments which historical horror story we should explore next. Until next time, stay curious and stay brave.